I'm happy to be here and happy to provide some insight and excited to be part of this panel that'll be sharing some information with you.
Well, thank you, Brian. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Yep.
Eniola?
Yep. My name is Eniola Campbell with Alcatel-Lucent. Alcatel-Lucent is a global company. We operate in 130 countries. We make end-to-end telecom solutions. We're probably the biggest, I would say, the biggest telecom equipment manufacturer in the world. We make equipment ranging from wireline to wireless. In North America, we're one of two major RAN vendors. In particular, I handle the AT&T account. I'm a director of sales for the wireline and microwave solution set, handling the United States, coast to coast. I have a nationwide sales team that sells those product sets. I've been closely associated with DAS, small cells build out, as well as the associated front haul and back haul solutions that's needed for that for the last 7 years, as those solution sets have begun to proliferate. On the wireline side, I heard the mayor talk about the Google build-out. On that side, I'm heavily involved in the GPON build-out that AT&T is doing nationwide as well. So I have insight and able to look across both the wireline and the wireless technologies at the migration that's happening. Within Alcatel-Lucent, we work closely with a number of companies here on the panel. In particular in the Southwest region, we're doing a lot of work, particularly for venue build out with AT&T. We also supported the Super Bowl that recently happened from a backhaul solution set, backhauling the DAS and the small cell solution sets. With AT&T, I've been able to work with them on as they proliferate small cells and deal with the challenges that they face on doing that. And so, like my colleagues here on the panel, looking forward to sharing some of those insights that I've seen as this has started to roll out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Noah. Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike Alt. I'm the Vice President of Network Design for Extenet Systems. Extenet is a distributed network architecture host company, so we design, build, operate all kinds of distributed networks, DAS networks, small cell networks, anything that's not the traditional macro environment. We've got about 70 outdoor networks operational across the United States. We've got about over 100 million square feet of indoor DAS or distributed networks that we own and operate. Similar to, of course, what Crown does. It's a very similar business model where we have multiple tenants, excuse me, on one network that is shared across all of them to provide cellular services, as well as a little bit of Wi-Fi, although cellular is really our primary product. I'm excited to be here today, excited to be on the panel, excited to be in 68-degree weather. It's pretty cold in Chicago, so thanks so much.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. I guess let's start with the first question, which I'll kind of throw out, and certainly a general question about, certainly over the last number of years, the DAS and small cell world has certainly changed and evolved. So I'll start with you, Mike. Where do you see it going in the future?
You don't want to go the other way? I'm just kidding. It's been interesting watching the transition go from the macros to the DAS. A lot of players originally put them out and weren't sure how they interacted together. That's getting solved, but now it's migrating to small cells. We saw AT&T aggressively rolling those out for about a year and a half, and then we saw the brakes hit real hard this quarter, and literally just, I'll stop there. But some of the other carriers are still doing it.
Yes.
But it's very interesting to see how they pull back a fair amount of capital this quarter and year so far. So I still see a huge need for DAS. I see it continuing to grow. I think it's going to shift a little bit with some of the different new players coming in, companies like Spider Cloud and people like that who are just not traditional DAS, but looking for ways to get in-building coverage in spots where traditionally, not every building owner wants to have everything run through their building. So
right.
They're looking for ways to make it easier to install, easier to operate, and smarter networks that will kind of sniff, figure out the channels, and operate smartly. So.
Same question?
Yes,
we can't ask a different one? So from our perspective, you're going to see about a 5 times increase in demand on data consumption over the next 10 years through 2025, right? That behavior is going to primarily be driven by what are called your digital natives, right? Your 15 to 34-year-old segment of smartphone users that are very into music, into video on their phones, into applications. Those applications consume a lot of data, and in order to support that data consumption, the carriers are going to have to expand those networks. I mean, there's just no other way around it. The continuous apps that require ubiquitous, I can't say that word, connectivity are also going to be important in the expansion of that data consumption. So I think that plays heavily into the carrier's need to support it. Bottom line, the technologies that support that sort of expansion, 5G, I wish I would have got to go to that summit. I think it's after this one, right?
That's right.
So hopefully I don't say something too out of line, but that's a little ways out, right? I think from our perspective, it's another 5 to maybe 6, 8 years before you see something truly beneficial that comes out of 5G. So alternatively, what do you have? You have new spectrum, right? Which is extremely costly. I think the carrier spent, what, $45 billion on the last AWS-3 auction. So that's not the cheapest way to increase your capacity or expand your network. So most likely, what they're going to need to do is to densify that network and to expand it geospatially for geospatial uniformity. And the best way to do that is to leverage your existing spectrum and densify your existing networks. And the most viable solutions to do that, I mean, especially in the areas that this densification needs to occur rather, is in or with small cells or DAS, right? You're not going to go stick a large tower, unfortunately, in a lot of these urban environments where they're heavily populated and folks are dying to upload a video to Facebook or stream Instagram or, you know, brag on Twitter, whatever the case may be. So from our perspective, we're obviously heavily invested in the space, and you know, because of the growth that's associated with the smartphone usage and demand, it's not going away. And carriers just have to find efficient ways to leverage what they have and deploy cost-effective networks. And as a result, I think small cell and DAS isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, Chad. How about you, Brian? Your views on the matter?
No, I appreciate it. You know, just kind of piggybacking off of what Chad mentioned, when you think about the future technologies that are coming out, you know, I think everybody here that either runs a business or started off in any type of business strategy, I mean, the key idea is identify idea, hopefully it's a very strong niche, exploit it, and become very successful at it. Make it repeatable, and make sure you go to market effectively. All right, that's, you know, business 101 if you think about it, you know, in a general scale. I may be generalizing it, but that's the philosophy as far as the way CommScope approaches DAS and new technologies. So we're in a niche area. We're in an area where we know that at the end of the day, it's a simple approach. The customers need coverage. Whether you're a service provider, whether you're an integrator, or you're a third-party neutral host partner of CommScope, you need coverage. So the future of what we see technology migrating towards is exploiting what is already there, but becoming more intelligent about it. You know, the old cliche about working smarter, not harder. You know, the technology is maturing as far as coverage solutions is concerned. We know it's a competitive environment, but we believe a lot of our research and where we're going with our development with our product platforms makes things a lot more simpler. So flexibility and simplicity are very important towards any type of DAS deployment. A great example is looking at our next generation platforms. And what we're doing is incorporating a lot of intelligence that normally is manual today. You know, a lot of organizations today are spending a lot of time and effort and dollars, truth be told, on trying to deploy these networks. What we're doing is building that intelligence. As I introed earlier, the fact that we're a global organization, we see best practices on what's worked in EMA, what's worked in Saudi, what's worked in North America, and evolve that into our research and development, our product platforms in Germany and Italy. And what we're coming up with are great solutions, a lot of intelligence, almost like a self-optimizing type of mindset. But the whole goal here is to give your employees, your technicians, your partners a tool. DAS is a tool, a network interface that allows a simple way of deploying and maintaining that coverage above and beyond that on-air date, above and beyond, a launch date, making sure that the whole life cycle of the system is operational and cost effective. And that's pretty much where CommScope sees a lot of the future of where we're going with DAS.
So from an Alcatel-Lucent standpoint, I kind of look at the two separately. So from a DAS standpoint, we don't make DAS products, we make backhaul products to support that. In that arena, what we see, and in particular to North America, once again, global company, I agree with Brian. You really have to look at across the globe the best practices. I think in North America, a lot of the DAS solutions were put in, particularly for large venues. AT&T built out aggressively for that, as did a bunch of other carriers. What has happened in that scenario is the bandwidth increases are starting to happen, so they're exploring how to maximize that, what is needed from a growth standpoint on that, as well as how's that impacting the backhaul solution sets. And so a lot of that is going on. From a small cell standpoint, I think it's a very challenging one, depending on who the carrier is and where they sit with their overall macro RAN build out. So if you look at some of the bigger carriers, the AT&T, the Verizons, they have such a large embedded base of RAN, and they struggle with the small cell deployments in the sense of how do I place it, how do I work with the enterprise customers to put that in, how do I work with the various cities to put those solution sets in. So when I talk to AT&T about small cells and what their vision of it was and where they're at today, they see indoor small cells going in where they partner with enterprise pretty okay, because they can work on the engineering design, they can work on the backhaul solution sets, and they have a partner that's working with them. On outdoor small cells, they struggle. And the struggle has to do more so, not with the technology, but things like site acquisition, things like engineering RF design, things like how do I take my small cell strategy and implement it along with my macro strategy. And so a lot of that is still kind of being worked out. And I think a lot of the companies in the room is where you can really help these large carriers with that part of the network, because it more so than the technology, it's putting it in. Now, where's the technology going? We continue to work on new solution sets, particularly on small cells for increased bandwidth, for multi-standard, so being able to support not only the 3G but the 4G standards and whatever's coming in the future, as well as multi-tenant. So being able to support an AT&T, a Verizon, multiple carriers on the same solution set, so you're not building a solution set just for one carrier, but for multiple carriers. So a lot of dynamics are going in that arena, but I think also a lot of opportunities exist.
I'm going to capitalize on a couple comments that were made earlier. One, Eniola and Mike both mentioned the interaction between existing macro networks and the new small cell or distributed networks. That is a significant challenge for anybody who's operating in the space, not only to the carriers, but for neutral host providers as well. In many instances, we don't get a lot of visibility as to what the macro looks like, and so we have to make some assumptions and make some declarations as to how we can contain the small cell network to stay exactly that, as a small cell network, and not have a negative interaction with the macro network or vice versa. So that's a challenge. I know that TTS Mike had mentioned at TTS that that's something that they're specializing in, which is actually a significant benefit, because it's not something that's widely known today. Second challenge that we see is there's no doubt that there's going to be a continued proliferation of distributed networks, and we've all discussed that. We talked about demands. Nobody ever comes up to me and says, I wish I was less connected. That doesn't happen. So one of the challenges of that, when you're talking about these, what's ultimately a massive increase in cell splitting, essentially in infrastructure, is you have to take some of the considerations of the municipalities on the outdoor space, but then also the venues. The carriers are very driven, for very good reasons, to put in their own small cell applications. They're cheaper for them than maybe a neutral host DAS may be. Depending on the economics, it can go back and forth. Certainly, it's cheaper for them in that they don't have to supply both the source for the DAS as well as pay for the DAS itself. So they are very invested in putting in their own small cell architecture. Well, a venue owner such as the Sheraton here may say, you know, I don't really want to see 5 boxes right next to each other. I only want to see one. And so there are some definite venue considerations you have to take into consideration when you're determining what the best solution is. And then the last one that is somewhat, it's touched on, but it's not necessarily emphasized with small cell architecture, is the amount of interconnectivity that's necessary. And he only kind of mentioned all the backhaul circuitry and all the backhaul electronics that are necessary. It is easy for anybody who is participating within a small cell environment or a distributed network architecture environment, I should say, to focus less on what kind of RF hardware are we going to deploy and more on how are we going to get the interconnectivity that's necessary both on the backhaul side and on the front haul side. You know, things that front haul wasn't even a term that was used 3 years ago. And now we're talking about that as a necessity in order to make these work. So there's definitely no doubt that this is going to be a continued trend with the proliferation of these devices, of these solutions. And it's ultimately how we manage through some of these challenges in order to determine how quickly and efficiently we can deploy those solutions.
Mike, thank you all for your perspective on that. I guess moving on, certainly budgets are always a concern. You know, whether you're building a network, whether certainly in your own home, what your wife wants, what your kids want. So, where do you expect budgets going in the future in terms of what carriers are spending or other enterprise vendors spending on the network systems?
Well, I mean, the biggest battle the carriers have is how do they fit all the capacity? I mean, the ever growth of it's just exponential. I mean, it's amazing how much when you look at from just the past 3 or 4 Super Bowls, we got great data on that, and it's every single year it's grown 50, 60, I mean, even 120% some years. So the amount of traffic is huge. So the key for them is how do they keep up with the data demand to keep customers happy? Part of that is they do cell splits, they put in offloads with DAS, they put in all those type of things. But again, you still have to manage the RF environment. And a lot of times they'll put new capacity in without really down tilting the surrounding sites, which need to happen. So that's some of the stuff that we come back in and help them with is what's the exact amount so you down tilt enough to optimize it without pulling coverage out of other buildings, hurting other customers. But there's a whole huge need. So the budgets have to continue to grow and invest, otherwise they're going to get behind. And once you get behind capacity, it's an ugly game to try to manage. We went in and helped do New York, Manhattan, for example, 3 or 4 years ago for one carrier and really helped clean that market up. I mean, the drop call rate went in half in 3 months, so it was a huge improvement. So, but it's a very difficult thing. A lot of things is a lot of carriers don't have electrical tilts yet, remote electrical tilts. Some of them only have half their network or even 30% of their network. So there's a huge amount of swap out that's still going to need to go on for, and most of the tower crews in here are still going to be very busy swapping out antennas, getting smarter antennas, better roll off, all those kind of things to make it a cleaner environment for DAS to operate. So.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Mm-hmm. How about you, Chad?
My turn. So I don't think there's really any question that the carriers are going to have to increase their budgets and increase their spending in the DAS small cell environment. Look at the competitive nature of the cell phone plans and the advertising in the marketplace. If you look closely, it dawned on me the other day, and I don't know why, after 20-some years in the business, I'm just starting to see this, but the carriers always advertise to their strengths, right? So if you think about Sprint, right, what do they have? A lot of high band capacity. So what do they offer? A really cheap data plan. But if you go test some of the other low and mid-range spectrum of their network, you know, you'd find be a little more strained and challenged. But if you really look across the spectrum of the carriers, right? If you take Verizon and AT&T, they're very solid in the low to mid-band range of their spectrum and their spectrum management. So what are they going to do to help increase efficiency in their high band? They're going to leverage the existing assets and the existing spectrum that they own. And how can they do that very effectively? Use small cells. Split the cells, deploy small cells and manage that high band capacity to support the increased data usage that's going to be required. That's AT&T and Verizon. If you look at Sprint and T-Mobile, Sprint being a little bit of an anomaly, right? They have a pretty high percentage of high band spectrum, but both of those carriers need to significantly increase their low and mid-range spectrum if they're going to remain competitive, right? So what's that mean? Well, it may mean a few more towers, right? Which isn't so terrible for Crown Castle. It may mean a lot more DAS nodes or some small cells, so we like that too. But overall, you know, if they're going to remain competitive in the long term, all of them, they're going to have to spend the money to remain competitive. And we believe that it's going to be in the space that all of us in this room would like to see them increase it in. So that's it.
No, I wholly agree there, Chad. How about you, Brian?
Well, I think when it comes to budget, there's two things that obviously come pretty clear. I mean, as Chad mentioned, it's important for the carriers to spend money. And, you know, there's always, if you've been in this industry, there's always a boom, there's always a bust. You know, and I don't think there's a bust cycle anymore where companies are failing. I think companies are just getting smarter. And the reality is how do you make use of that investment during a bust cycle? Well, the reality is you hear it today, especially in this industry. You know, AT&T's budget last year, fiscal 2014, was rough. Caught a lot of people off guard, and especially when you look at this ecosystem from an equipment manufacturer down an integrator down to the actual service provider themselves. One leading indicator that we see, especially when we look at forecasting equipment, you know, growth trends, revenue trends, I think there's a big dependency this year to get through the bust with the third-party neutral host organizations. You know, mitigating risk is the #1 concern with any operator. They want a return on investment on that equipment yesterday, right? If you could shorten that time cycle and at the same time meet an on-air date, it's a big win-win. The reality is that's not available. And the approach for the operator was to invest that capital today to hit those two benchmarks. The reality is they don't have the capital today. So I think being able to extrapolate in a 3-5 year financial window to get the equipment in market, to hit that on-air date today without constraining your capital and shifting it more towards an operating expenditure model is their mindset. And this is where the integrators and the third-party neutral host organizations are going to be very fruitful. Now, in that regard, when we look at alignment, you know, obviously when we look at alignment of our feature set of our equipment, there were comments made about utilizing spectrum. I think a critical piece on any type of DAS infrastructure when a choice is made is how do you address scalability and capacity enhancements? Do you have to rewire? Do you have to reinstall? Do you have to purchase more equipment? What happens if you actually can choose equipment early on that can scale and grow with simple software fixes and have, you know, minimize the amount of manpower and man hours it would take to go ahead and increase the performance of that system? So factoring in the current state of the business challenge that we're at today in the industry and knowing what we can design into the equipment to provide scalability and flexibility is the trending. You know, that's where the industry is definitely heading, and that's the way we're aligning our strategy right now at this point. So,
All right, thanks, Brian.
So I agree with everything the my other panelists have said. I've seen a lot of the carriers, to the point made earlier, become a lot more smarter in the way they are investing their capital dollars. In the sense that in the past, the way they addressed scenarios is they spent a lot of money. They didn't necessarily look at utilization rates, and they thought, build a network and they will come. What has now started to happen is these carriers are looking more closely at their business plans of where they build out their network, where they continue to invest their dollars so that the return on investment is higher. They've also hyped up their utilization rates. So in the past, when they saw a network hit about 60% utilization, they would start to add capacity. Now they are really trying to make those utilization rates in the 70, 80% range. to the point Brian made. So what they need to make those things happen is they need better tools to understand what are the trigger rates to add equipment, because now they're kind of doing ad hoc, and a lot of these carriers are getting caught. I also think in this competitive environment, what's happened is the T-Mobiles and the Sprints of the world have really ratcheted up the competition on the AT&Ts and the Verizon. The AT&T and the Verizons, I think, were in the mindset of we've pretty much built out our network from an LTE standpoint. We're going to leverage our strengths. We're going to improve the ARPU, average revenue per user, and T-Mobile and Sprint have taken those plans and thrown them out the window because of their aggressiveness in the competitive landscape. So it's making them, these bigger carriers, go back and relook at their business plans on how do they continue to build out an aggressive manner to combat the competition. And that's where things like DAS and small cells come into play, because it's a lower cost point to get out for further capacity and coverage. I think it's going to continue to be challenging, particularly when you look at where the carriers are spending their money right now. They're spending it on acquisitions outside the U.S. They're spending it on acquiring more spectrum that normally takes 1 to 2 years before that comes to fruition as products that they then buy and implement. They're also monitoring the regulatory environment, right? The net neutrality ruling is really going to make a lot of these carriers go back and take a look at their business strategy. So all of these things are playing out on top of just the overall need to provide more money back to their shareholders. So it's a lot of moving dynamics. That said, I think at the end of the day, as my other colleagues have said, the capital budgets will increase. It'll increase with them kicking and screaming, but it's going to increase if they're going to remain competitive. So, but it will play out over the next 1 to 2 years, I believe.
So so what Eniola just said, one thing I wanted to capitalize on was we're seeing a raise in capital. We're seeing capital budgets going to be that are increasing over time. If there's no other indicator, look at any analyst report from any of the carriers, and what do you see? Every carrier is now committing to some number of small cells. It's a buzzword. It really, the analysts are appreciative of that. They're looking, you know, put a microphone in front of them. How many small cells are you going to build this year? So it's a strong indicator that it has gained the attention of Wall Street. It's certainly gained the attention of I mean, the carriers already had the attention of it, but it is a viable solution. It is an expectation that it's going to continue to grow. However, so to Eniola's and Brian's point, what we're also seeing is there is not only increased capital spend, but there is increased pressure for making that capital stretch further. And they're looking at areas that they haven't looked at in the past. Case in point, if you talk to anybody who's over at Verizon, you're going to hear someone talk about C-RAN, Consolidated RAN, Cloud RAN, which is consolidating equipment into areas, hotel areas, you know, hoteling, the hoteling concept, where you're putting several pieces of infrastructure all together. It's not just fill rates on the macro sites that the carriers are looking at. It's how do I maximize the utilization of all my assets, which would be backhaul assets, which would be feeder assets in the case of a distributed network architecture where you have a baseband unit in one location and a remote in another. They're looking at how do I maximize, how do I make sure that there's a big enough pipe to serve all of these BBUs in this example in this one location, and I can have the fill rate of the BBUs themselves be optimized. So they are looking to stretch not only how much spend they're going to make, but they're also looking to stretch how they can increase that spend over time. The appetite for the carriers as to what they want to build is always going to be greater than the capital budgets that they're allocated. And likewise, you know, no different than the demand that the users have is always going to be greater than the offered capacity. So how various companies can offer products and services that will stretch those dollars, not only take advantage of those which are being released, but also stretch those dollars beyond those in ways that they haven't done it in the past, is going to be key for this to ultimately become a stable situation.
That's a great perspective, Mike. You know, certainly, you know, deploying a network is always being met with challenges. You know, whether we're talking about small cell, DAS, macro site, even individual site in your neighborhood, or certainly even here in this facility. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges in deploying a network going forward?
Well, one of the, again, one of the biggest things is trying to make it work well with macros, especially if you're deploying a neutral host DAS. And a lot of what I see, a lot of capital was spent on actually overbuilding the DAS too many times. We come in to optimize it, and I don't want to talk DB, but they're trying to overcome multiple sectors that are just blasting. They were built to cover it originally, the macros were. Nothing was done to it. The DAS is being put in it, not just big venues, but commercial buildings too. And but if you go back and pull the macro back even 5 to 10 dB, you're going to save your cost about half the cost of what it takes to build that DAS. And it will operate much cleaner, gives you a much easier handoff between the two systems, and really more longevity for everything. And the venue owner who owns the venue is happier because there's less antennas everywhere. They don't want to see half that anyways. So if you can figure out a way to do both, it's a great marriage.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Back to you, Chad.
Well, for us, the bulk of what we're doing right now, and when I thought about this question, the challenges associated with it, making some notes here. The other panelists, it's Alcatel and CommScope. If you guys wouldn't mind developing a box about this size, 40 watt with an integrated antenna, all the challenges go away, and we're good. So it's the equipment
Got your
deployment.
homework now.
Sorry, couldn't resist. Unfortunately, that's it, right? We went through kind of an evolution. We deployed a lot of DAS nodes, and it's interesting because we walked into jurisdictions all over the country and we said, here's a box that we're going to need to put in for this DAS system. And so they got really comfortable with the box and the antenna and everything associated with that particular deployment. And then we showed up about a year later and said, here's another box. Oh, and here's another antenna. Well, this one's slightly larger, but I promise it's not getting any bigger. Well, 6 months later, here we come, and we got a bigger antenna. So it's managing the expectations, especially in the right-of-way environment, for deployment of the equipment and the infrastructure. The challenges around working with not only the jurisdiction, but the utility company, right? So I want to go utilize existing infrastructure, but the owner of that infrastructure, even though it's public right-of-way infrastructure, doesn't want me on it, doesn't want it to be used for that. Well, the city also doesn't want anything new placed in the right-of-way. So now what do you do? We don't have an invisible antenna yet, right? That doesn't, whoever comes out with that's going to be really, really rich.
It's an R&D right now.
I'm not kidding. I had to use that comment with the city the other day. I'm like, seriously, if I would make it invisible, I would, but this is as good as it gets. So I think that managing the expectations, a lot of the cities know this is coming. They know it's an inevitable reality, but they still have pretty unrealistic expectations. It's like, guys, we took it from a 300-foot self-support tower, and then we got it down to an 80-foot monopole, and now we're on a 30-foot existing utility pole. I really just want to put this 2-foot antenna up. Can you work with me? And, it doesn't go over as easy as you would think. So I think that, and I think that leads to stealthing. One of the big challenges that we're working with is coming up with a stealth solution in several cities. And the interesting thing there is it's a different solution in every city. So that creates a lot of challenges, and not just for us. We have a product management team that goes through and makes sure that the equipment is going to operate, it's not going to burn up. The thermal elements of it will remain intact, and that the equipment will continue to operate properly when we put it into a stealth streetlight pole or a decorative streetlight pole. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that side of the business for those companies that are involved in that piece. We're always looking to come up with new and creative ways to try to hide what we're deploying. And then I think lastly, some of the challenges are resources. There's a lot of folks moving into space. Every time I visit a new city, I seem to turn on the morning news and see Google's coming to town, which gives me a little bit of a heart attack every time I see it, because obviously outside plant is a large part of what we do on the small cell side. So then I start hearing, well, we're going to, and incidentally, I'll walk into a jurisdictional office and they go, oh, well, Google's coming. I'm like, that's great. So what's that mean for you? Well, they said they're going to bring in 50 line crews and 20 bore rigs and God knows what else, and they're going to tie up our permitting staff for the next 20 years. So it's like, what do you do about that, right? So my biggest challenge with my teams and what I'm working on is staying out as far ahead of not just the competition, quite frankly, but even those that aren't necessarily direct competition but are deploying in the same space, in the outside plant environment, because the make ready on the poles, there's only so much interduct, you know, the whole network challenge associated with that has gotten competitive. And I think the last part of it is finding good partners. We really have to rely heavily on the resources that support our deployments, and finding the right partners that can help us build, you know, quality carrier class systems that are reliable, functional, and deliver on what we said that promise was going to be when we signed up the carrier for that deal is another big part of that. So I think those are probably the three main things that I thought about when it came to that. There's about 50 million other little ones, but those are probably the big ones. So.
Well, thanks, Chad. Appreciate that.
Well,
How about you, Brian?
So, no joke, I mean, Chad makes a comment about really designing equipment that would be the size of a pizza box that can take care of everything, one size fits all. I mean, I have a standing biweekly meeting with Crown every 2 weeks, and it's amazing just to see the creativity that that product development team out in San Jose is, and the procurement team out in Pittsburgh. It's amazing just to see the creativity as far as solutions that actually come to market. And we're happy to know that we're one of the key suppliers that really get them to market and on air with that standing quality with the operators. That being said, I think when it comes to budget, you know, there's things, you know, what I call post-launch that make it very economical for DAS to get that true return on investment. And it's the operating side of the equipment, all right? The reality is no equipment is 100% bulletproof. You know, there is an RMA that occurs, there are some failures. We prided ourselves with our research and development teams in Germany to make sure that the equipment is of high quality and standards. The important thing to understand is when you're maintaining a system, if there is an issue that does happen, you know, what tools are available that can enable the integrator, the third-party neutral host operator to forewarn an operator before they even know the issue actually occurs. And that's the intelligence piece that I keep highlighting about what needs to happen with the DAS equipment on operating several of these different networks. So that in itself definitely reduces the overall cost. You know, when you look at budgets that are set aside for maintaining networks, and just imagine if you actually show cost savings, shifting that dollar into CapEx spending. You know, getting through this bus cycle that I keep talking about. And I think it's just, that's one area that we're helping a lot of our customers getting smarter about their network deployments. You know, aside from that, getting granular, a lot of the built-in RF test measurement capability is being built into our equipment. So several times when you look at, you know, PIM-related issues, when you're looking at return loss issues, failure on equipment that are impacting drop calls, block calls on the network, or slow data throughput, being able to put that intelligence into the infrastructure instead of having a technician dispatched with separate pieces of test gear to go ahead and enable and identify what the issue is. Next thing you know, it's 3 days later and you finally isolate the problem. We're incorporating a lot of this built-in testing capability into our systems. You know, and that is letting the service provider, the network integrator, become more intelligent about the network. And in essence, building their credibility stronger with the actual operator themselves. So that along with remote management, I think that reducing costs and maintaining these networks, you can't fly people on birds every single day. It's costly. You can't regionalize teams, especially if you're a small, medium-sized integrator and you're trying to cover the United States. So remote management capability is the intelligent piece that we're building into our equipment that allows people to work smarter. You know, and that's a big part of what we're really focusing on. And I think a lot of these features that we're embedding in our current platforms and future platforms are really allowing organizations to become a lot more wiser on the way that they're approaching launches and managing budget.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay. So This was an interesting question. I thought about a lot last night because, as a lot of the other panel members have mentioned, there are a lot of challenges with DAS and small cells. But if I look at some of the top ones and try to kind of look at some of the top issues, the installation in the near term, it's the installation, the engineering of it, site acquisition are major concerns, even more so than the technology day. It's the day-to-day getting in there to put these solution sets in and what's involved with them, from not only placing the access points, but the backhaul of those solution sets, whether it be fiber, whether it be some form of microwave solution sets, line of sight or non-line of sight, and the carriers getting help in those areas. Because quite frankly, within the organizations, they're designed for big network build-outs. They're not designed for things like DAS and small cells. So they really have to look to third-party vendors to help them with those solution sets. I think I think Chad mentioned technology, and I agree. As an equipment provider, the challenge is always how more can you make the solution set integrated, smaller. There's always the joke with enough time and money, you can get anything done. Well, nobody has enough time, and nobody's going to spend enough money to get it to some optimal solution set. So you have to work within the constraints that you have to make the solution sets better. But that said, as an equipment provider, we're always looking for ways to make the product better. Along those lines, I think some of the things that have to be looked at when you look at DAS and small cells as an equipment provider is maybe getting some different type of guidelines. So a lot of the things that you do are built to GR specifications. When you look at a lot of the GR specifications that you have to build equipment to, it was built more around the macro network or the wireline type network. Some of the specifications that you have to do don't necessarily apply to small cell and DAS deployments, but in order to deploy the product, particularly with large carriers, you have to meet the spec. For instance, I'll give you an example. There's a thing called GR 47. As part of that, you have to do things like salt fog. So in order for your product to be deployed, you have to put it in a chamber for 30 days. It has to pass a salt fog where there is no kind of erosion on the product. Small cells get deployed primarily indoor, and very rarely do they get deployed in a coastal environment, maybe in a few instances. However, to deploy that product, you have to meet these specifications with large carriers. Hence, drives up the cost of the product, drives up the engineering design needed on the product set. If those kind of specifications are revisited, perhaps some other things can be done to make the products more innovative. That, we continue to work with the various carriers on those kind of things, but all of those things kind of build into some of the constraints on the design of the products that we have to do, and I'm sure my CommScope colleague shares some of my thoughts around those kind of things. Last but not least, the stealth. And we at Alcatel-Lucent are kind of leveraging a lot of work we've done, not only in North America, but in Europe and other places where we are building solution sets that kind of become invisible to the end users. But once again, it requires buy-in from the cities, municipalities, enterprises. What you find out with small cells, it's a lot easier when you have buy-in from a third party, whether it be an enterprise, a hotel, wherever you're trying to deploy it, to do those things. When you're dealing with the city, particularly on the outdoor solution sets, it becomes a lot more challenging, particularly for the large carriers because of the amount of money that they want for site acquisition and other things. So those are some of the challenges when I look at the deployments that I see.
So a couple things. One is, so we're talking a lot about headwinds. There is one tailwind that has really been benefiting, that's counteracting some of these that are mentioned. So municipality is a headwind, needless to say. Every municipality has some different flavors, different views. It kind of, as Chad mentioned, that there's every municipality you go into, they want something, this stealth solution doesn't work in this, works in this city and not in this city. As well as aesthetics, and that is both on the indoor and the outdoor side. There is a lot more of attention around how these things look. What is a tailwind is the educated public. So if you take 3-4 years ago, a lot of municipalities and certainly a lot of venue owners didn't even know what a distributed network was. And Now, not only is it much more mainstream such that if there's legislation that needed to be passed or needed to be written, it's already written, or there's some exception rules that we've seen in municipalities where they've said, well, if you're characterizing a DAS environment, you meet these requirements, then it's administrative approval as opposed to a full-blown zoning. So on the public side, you see, or in the outdoor space, you see a lot more educated public, especially when it comes to the municipalities, even to the point where we have actually heard residents come to us and say, we don't have coverage in our area, we don't have adequate capacity in our area, we don't want a tower. Can you guys come out and then we'll support you with the local municipality. So you can see that this is much more mainstream than it was previously. On the indoor side, with regards to an educated public, is now we're starting to see venues that are including this as part of their architectural plans. For new structures, new buildings that are coming forth, just like they have plumbing, electrical, ventilation, now they're talking about communications. And so they are preparing to put in some infrastructure themselves upon the new construction of a building, or even a retrofit situation where if they're coming in and doing a big remodel, they're starting to plan for this up front. So again, what was a headwind 3 to 4 years ago is now becoming much more of a tailwind for us, both from an economic perspective as well as in speed of deployment. The last challenge, dollars is always a challenge, of course, but the last challenge that Brian touched on a little bit was these networks are becoming so complex because of band configurations, because of band expansions. So the carrier adds a new band, and guess what? Now there's a whole new set of equipment that has to be deployed in order to support that band. So there is a complexity of the equipment, kind of what Chad mentioned, as well as a complexity of mixing the equipment together. If you ever deal with Verizon, you've heard the word PIM. Everybody knows what PIM is, and it's a reality. It is something that has to be considered that didn't have to be considered previously. So just managing through that complexity and coming up with solutions that are expandable, but at the same time aren't expandable to the point where you're causing a detriment within the network has become a significant challenge.
All right, thank you, Mike. Well, I'd certainly like to, I guess we're out of time. We had a few more questions. We could go on all day. But I'd like to thank each of our panelists here today. And I think it was certainly very, very insightful, certainly insightful for me as well. I'm sure to many of those of you out here. And well, thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.